the line itself is fundamentally flawed. Now is not the time for a ceasefire. The time for a ceasefire was in October, on October the 8th.
This posture that the U.S. is somehow outside of this, right? Hoping, wishing, lobbying, and not an active partner.
They killed the head of the negotiations. I mean, imagine if a Martian landed on planet Earth and said, tell me about these negotiations. Well, one side just killed the chief negotiator. Kamala Harris is not on course for a landslide. She's neck and neck in polls with Trump. She is at risk of losing Michigan, maybe Georgia, where there are big Arab American, Muslim American populations.
Okay, Joe Biden's out of the way. Maybe we can defeat Trump. But the genocide is too big to be controlled by them. Hi, I'm Naomi Klein.
And I'm Mehdi Hasan.
And on today's show, it's time to get unshocked about the Democratic Party and its insistence that it is trying very hard to get a ceasefire. Now, calling for a ceasefire, claiming to be working for it around the clock, is now a routine talking point from senior officials in the Biden administration. It's also a standard applause line in Kamala Harris's campaign speeches, including in her highest profile speech to date. So let's hear a clip.
With respect to the war in Gaza, President Biden and I are working around the clock because now is the time to get a hostage deal and a ceasefire deal done.
So who doesn't want both of those things? Hostages returned, ceasefire,
Yep.
Obviously. But what's striking to me, among other things, is just, first of all, the idea that it's now and not 11 months earlier, or almost 11 months, but also this posture that the U.S. is somehow outside of this, right? Hoping, wishing, lobbying, and not an active partner, which has been blocking ceasefire resolutions at the United Nations, that has been arming Israel nonstop, including very recently. So how did this go over? You were in the hall, Mehdi. What was it like when she's talking about Gaza to this crowd?
It's interesting, Naomi, you should mention that, because I was wondering what the reaction would be. And she first began with the usual, Israel has a right to defend itself. We will always support Israel. Got huge applause, which made me uncomfortable because Israel is engaged in a genocide, in my view, our view. And then she went into the Gaza line about self-determination, about ceasefire, working. Now is the time to get a hostage deal, as we just heard. And it got huge applause, much bigger applause, probably the biggest applause line of the night. And I think every time Gaza got mentioned at the DNC by Bernie Sanders, didn't get mentioned very often, but when it got mentioned by Bernie and AOC and Keith Ellison and Kamala Harris, it got a lot of applause. The delegates clearly want this. The base of the party clearly does support Palestinian freedom. How much they support it is a different question, but they clearly want it. And it was very frustrating to hear that applause, because on the one hand, I'm glad they backed the Palestinians. On the other hand, as you say, the line itself is fundamentally flawed. Now is not the time for a ceasefire. The time for a ceasefire was in October, on October the 8th.
Right, exactly. It's as if something happened last week that made this the time. I keep thinking about Cori Bush, the congresswoman from St. Louis, Missouri, introduced a resolution calling for, quote, an immediate de-escalation and ceasefire in Israel and occupied Palestine on October 16th. Yeah. October 16th, because the time was actually then and every day since.
And she and other members of the squad were attacked by the White House. They were called despicable. They were attacked as Hamas apologists by many in the media. She has since lost her primary, will no longer be in Congress because of the stance she took on Gaza. And yet, as ever, the anti-war left was ahead of the curve, was ahead of everyone else, just like we were on Iraq, just like we were on every other issue. And now we have this situation where everyone, as you say, wants both of those things. Who would not want a ceasefire and a hostage release? It's like apple pie. Who doesn't want that? Actually, not me. I'm not a big apple pie fan, but that's a discussion for another day. But I would say, Naomi's not impressed with that. No, I'm not a fan of.
I know, you have very weird food things, and
I'm
we can discuss it another time. Okay, all right.
We're going to get thrown off. We will definitely have a food discussion now that I see you've got some strong opposing views. But everyone wants this stuff. And yet, when the left were doing, and not just the left, Naomi, I remember when I say not just the left, I mean an interesting part of the left, the Jewish anti-war left, was pushing for a ceasefire very early on. Jewish Voices for Peace were at the Capitol in October 2023, calling for a ceasefire. You were there that day, speaking, I think, at a rally in D.C. Let's play a bit of that clip.
These are not our leaders. not in the Knesset with its so-called unity government, and not here in Congress, which reconvenes now in part in order to approve new money and new weapons to send to Israel for its genocidal attack on Palestinians. But there are some leaders back there, like Cori Bush, who sponsored that ceasefire resolution, who has total moral clarity, like Rashida Tlaib. Rashida, we stand with you. And the list is growing, and we will not rest until we get many more endorsers for the ceasefire resolution.
Naomi, what do you remember about that time? Because it feels like we were in a very small minority, at least in terms of the DC, New York political media bubble.
Yeah, absolutely. That was October 18th, 2 days after the ceasefire resolution was introduced by Cori Bush, and that was a huge rally organized by Jewish Voice for Peace, and If Not Now, thousands of people there, hundreds of people were arrested in the rotunda, because it was already clear then that there was no military solution. It was already clear then that the Israeli government was out of its mind with collective punishment, revenge, and had already stated, multiple leaders had already stated, a genocidal intent. The quotes are in South Africa's case before the ICJ. They were already pledging to cut off food and water and had already done so. Hospitals were already under attack. Journalists were already under attack.
Yep. We knew it all.
Yeah, we knew it all. And they've made good on it in the month since. But the point was, and I was on the Hill that day. I was at the rally, but I was also having some meetings with Congress people and senators. Francesca Albanese was there too, and we met with one congressperson together, and we're laying out the case that genocidal intent was already clear and that the U.S. would be liable. A lot of people in that crowd were actually mourning friends and family members who had been directly impacted by the October 7 attacks, which had just happened a week and a half earlier. But the theme of that day was not in our name. Do not use our grief to justify a genocide. It was already that clear. So the party that didn't stand with Cori Bush, by the way, when she came under attack by AIPAC in her primary, has now caught up with her almost 11 months later, and they're claiming that it is, and so now they're saying the time for ceasefire is now. This isn't just happening in the U.S., right, Mehdi? This sort of strange timeline on what the time should be.
So Keir Starmer, who's the current Labour Prime Minister since he won a landslide victory in July, back when he was opposition leader in October, Naomi, he came under a lot of pressure to call for a ceasefire. Instead, he said Israel has a right to block water and electricity. And, he supported basically war crimes and then walked it back and said, I never said that, even though he said it on tape. But what's worse, not only did he not come out for a ceasefire, when he eventually came round to a ceasefire earlier this year, he went on Channel 5, a UK channel, and spoke to Jeremy Vine about his reasoning. Let's have a listen to what he said.
In the very early days, people were saying there should be an immediate ceasefire. And I said that would only benefit Hamas. We're now months down the line. Thousands of people have been killed in Gaza. There's a threatened defensive in Rafah, where there's a humanitarian catastrophe. And now is the time for a ceasefire.
Not earlier.
Because the circumstances...
It would have saved a lot of lives if you'd done it earlier.
The circumstances have changed dramatically.
Naomi, for me, when I listen to that, that is insane. He's saying that I didn't support a ceasefire then because it was too early. I'm supporting one now because everyone's died. Like, the whole point of the ceasefire is to prevent people dying. You don't come and pitch the ceasefire after tens of thousands of people are already dead.
I mean, to be clear, we do need a ceasefire, but we need more than a ceasefire. And there's something extraordinarily dishonest about this.
Naomi, it's funny you should mention dishonesty, because for me, that goes to the heart of what's been going on over the last 10 months. It goes to the heart of this Unshocked. One of the reasons you and I wanted to talk about this, and I think viewers, listeners really need to appreciate what's going on here, which is it's not just that the United States did not call for a ceasefire until very recently, and we could talk about what that even means. But not only did they not call for one, but they blocked one. They allowed the Israelis to block one. And then they lied to the world and said it's all the fault of Hamas. And I just very briefly want to remind people who are listening and watching of the timeline here, because the Hostages Families Forum, the group representing the hostages, have come out and said that there was a deal on the table. in the day or two after October the 7th. Hamas said on 8th, 9th, 10th October, this is according to the Hostages Families Forum and their intel, that Hamas had offered Israel a complete release of all the hostages and a ceasefire if Israel didn't do a ground invasion of Gaza, which of course the Israelis turned down. Khalid Mishal later that month, one of the Hamas senior leaders, said, we will release all the hostages if you stop bombing. This was reported in the Western press. It's been memory hold since. We then had a ceasefire deal in November, which again has been totally erased. 105 hostages were released. It worked. We got almost half the hostages out without violence. That deal fell apart. In December, the UN tried to resurrect it. The Security Council tried to pass a resolution. The US blocked it. They blocked it again in February. They vetoed that deal. And then finally, when Biden comes out in May with his 3-part ceasefire plan, the US then gets the United Nations, Naomi, to pass a resolution saying Israel has accepted the deal. It's in the text of the resolution. They said, Israel's accepted the deal. Now Hamas needs to. The Israelis, meanwhile, are saying, no, we haven't. At every point over the last few months, Biden or Blinken or Harris or Sullivan says, well, the Israelis have accepted a deal. And then Netanyahu pops up and says, nope, I'm going to carry on fighting till I destroy Hamas, which is obviously not a ceasefire. And what's so fascinating and so dishonest, Netanyahu met with a group of hostages recently, Naomi, and he said, of hostage members, and Israeli television got hold of the audio. And you know what he says to them in this clip when they say, do a deal? He says, what deal? Which deal? From the horse's mouth. Netanyahu is saying there is no deal that he signed up for. The Americans are telling us in a UN resolution that he signed up to a deal weeks and months ago. So the bullshitting, the gaslighting is doing my head in.
There's a domestic audience that he plays to where he's very clear that there isn't a deal. And then there is this international kind of charade that is going on where we're all seeing, men in dark suits rushing around capitals in Doha and Cairo. And we're, having the press conference. Yeah, it's just around the corner. It's just around the corner. And I think we have to understand that this is worse than dishonest. This is part of the genocide. This allows it to unfold because if there's no pretext that it might stop, then the urgency to stop it would be greater, right? So there's a kind of dialectic between, oh yeah, it's just around the corner and we're negotiating very, very hard. And meanwhile, the bombs are accelerating. The war is expanding both to the West Bank and regionally, and it's not a war, it's a genocide.
And the hostages are dying too, by the way. The Israeli hostages. This is why the family members and the released hostages are so annoyed at Netanyahu, because by prolonging this war, he's endangering the people they claim to be fighting for. And I just want to play one quick clip from Zahiro Moore. Don't take it from me, people watching. You don't have to listen to Mehdi, Hasan, or Naomi Klein. Listen to Zahiro Moore, whose uncle died, was killed in captivity. And he came out recently and he pointed the finger squarely at Netanyahu. Have a listen.
Since the beginning of July, there has been a deal ready to be signed, but the new conditions added by Netanyahu, the main one being the Philadelphia corridor stipulation, are what is preventing this deal from happening. This is nothing but another one of Netanyahu's spins. We'd like to address President Biden directly and say, Netanyahu has been systematically torpedoing this deal. You cannot believe a word he says.
What's so interesting, Naomi, there is that Zahiro Moore, nephew of a dead hostage, makes it very clear that it's Netanyahu who's been moving the goalposts. It's Netanyahu who came along when we were so close to a deal, which even the Americans said, we're close to a deal. Netanyahu then says, oh, no, we're going to keep the Philadelphia corridor. We're going to keep the Netzarim corridor. These are these two parts of Gaza that even the Egyptian government says cannot be part of any deal. You have to get out, right? This is the Philadelphia corridor, which is on the border with Egypt, where they're not supposed to be any Israeli troops. And the Netzarim corridor, which divides Gaza north-south and basically turns it into a segmented, what they want to do, the West Bank, Bantustans, split it up into enclaves, don't have one territory. So of course the Palestinians in Gaza, even Hamas and the Egyptians are not going to agree to that. And what's so interesting about that clip is a hostage's nephew is saying, Netanyahu, you've done this. You've stopped the deal by bringing in these last-minute goalpost shifting operation.
Right, because the goal is to keep the facade of negotiations going on endlessly while they actually meet their political goals, their geopolitical goals, their territorial goals, which they're open about domestically, right? And so we have to understand that this is a strategy. This is what we really are getting Unshocked about. And we know it's a strategy because it isn't a new strategy. A lot of people have been pointing this out recently, which is that this is what the Israeli government did during the Camp David Accords and after, during the Oslo Accords. It's actually a very well-known colonial strategy in different contexts. I'm speaking to you from Canada. We have a phrase that we use called talk and log. So the idea is, people are trying to protect these old growth forests, and the government ties everybody up in these talks, negotiations, and meanwhile they fell the trees, and, and it's all gone. So we might call this talk and bomb, talk and grab, talk and invade.
Well,
I mean, it's multifaceted. But sorry, what were you going to say?
You just reminded me of a quote when you said the log quote. Michael Tarazi, who was a Palestinian-American lawyer in the 90s, who was a negotiator, he had an analogy. He said, if I remember it correctly, he said, negotiating with Israel during this peace process is like negotiating with your friend over how you split a pizza. And as you're deciding how to split the pizza, your friend keeps eating a slice. And then you're like, well, how do we split it? And I think that's the whole point, what they did with the two-state solution nonsense, where they kept building settlements and then saying, how do we divide the land? Well, we've taken more of the land while we were negotiating. Moeen Rabbani, who's a Palestinian analyst who I urge everyone to follow on Twitter, does fantastic, very, very informative historical Twitter threads. He tweeted recently about the ceasefire talks. He said they are a, quote, diversionary US-Israeli charade, or an Oslo process for genocide, if you will, which I thought is exactly what you were saying. It's just happening in plain sight.
Well, and Palestinians know all about this move because, once again, the Israelis have been explicit about it. Back to Ariel Sharon, told a Washington Post journalist in 1980 that when he was Minister of Agriculture, I believe at the time, that he took this journalist on a tour of the West Bank with a map explaining every outpost. And at that point, they were really tiny. There were 14,000 settlers. And he said, we're putting facts on the ground. This is the facts on the ground. So you've got your negotiators rushing around, putting on this charade. But meanwhile, you're putting facts on the ground that politically would be impossible to change. That was his hope. That was his strategy. And I think we're seeing something very similar. We know that was 14,000 settlers then. Now, by some counts, 700,000 settlers in the West Bank. That's what they mean by facts on the ground.
Yes, very much. And you know what's so similar is I mentioned the Netzarim corridor, which splits North and South Gaza between Israel and the Mediterranean Sea. That's actually named after a settlement that was in Gaza. So it is spooky a lot of people that are they going to bring back settlements? Netanyahu keeps saying, no, we're not going to resettle Gaza. But he just appointed a chief Gaza officer, a general who's got the title, which the Israeli press, Naomi, which is often far more blunt and honest than our own press, the Israeli press is referring to him as basically the new governor of Gaza. So we're full back to colonial exploitation of the land, of the strip. And you're right, the facts on the ground in this case are, we'll sit in Doha and have negotiations. We'll keep moving the goalposts. Meanwhile, we will bomb. We will kill. We will take more land, different parts of the Gaza Strip. Don't forget also, Naomi, they killed the head of the negotiations. I mean, imagine if a Martian landed on planet Earth and said, tell me about these negotiations. Well, one side just killed the chief negotiator. They assassinated him in Iran, but they claim to be good faith, interested in a ceasefire. Like, it's such nonsense. You can't kill the people you're negotiating with and say, well, it's not our fault the negotiations aren't working. The other side's being intransigent.
Well, it certainly, puts the lie to this perennial Israeli claim that we don't have a partner for peace. I mean, especially when you're actually assassinating the people you're negotiating with. This is also part of. I think we've all been horrified by the news of polio, of all kinds of infectious diseases spreading. The facts on the ground in Gaza. Even if it's contested whether or not it's going to be the settler dream or a demilitarized zone, I think they're still fighting this out internally. But what's clear is the strategy to make Gaza uninhabitable. And that is what is happening as the charade continues, as we follow the twists and turns.
And we know it's a charade, Naomi, to go back to Kamala Harris and how we started, because Kamala Harris, Joe Biden, Antony Blinken, when they talk about Gaza, they talk about it as if they are innocent bystanders. They are passers-by. They are pundits on the New York Times op-ed page saying, we wish there was a ceasefire. When we all know, Naomi, they have the power to impose a ceasefire tomorrow morning. I wrote a piece for The Guardian several months ago saying, be like Ronald Reagan, Joe Biden. Pick up the phone as Reagan did in 1982. He rang Menachem Begin, then far-right Prime Minister of Israel, said, stop bombing Beirut. You're killing too many kids. Within 20 minutes, the Israeli bombing stopped. Reagan actually withheld F-16 fighter jets back in the day. 75 jets, I think he suspended. So I'm not going to send them until you get out of Beirut. Right? Can you imagine an American president doing that now? Joe Biden did a minor pause on some bombs and people lost their minds. George Bush Sr., Naomi, in 1992, withheld $10 billion of loan guarantees to Israel because they wouldn't stop settlement building. That was another right-wing prime minister, Yitzhak Shamir. It amazes me that two Republican right-wing presidents were able to do what Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, Tony Blinken will not do right now.
Will not do, because they could do it. They could do it. I mean, they have the ultimate weapon, which is weapons.
Yes.
And they have, it's not like you need some new law on the books. You need to enforce U.S. laws. I mean, this brings us back to the DNC. Yeah, that would bring us back to
say arms embargo or I hate Netanyahu. She just say, you know, when I'm president of the United States, we're going to enforce the law. I'm a prosecutor.
Enforce the Leahy law. Yeah. Enforce the Leahy law, which says that the U.S. can't be sending weapons or selling weapons to known human rights violators, like a country that is being investigated for a credible case of genocide before the ICJ, also under investigations for war crimes, accused of war crimes by the ICC. I mean, the case is done. She is a prosecutor. I mean, this is the other thing about it, is that she also could be exposing this strategy that we've been talking about, the strategy of expanding the war regionally so that Israel looks more, vulnerable. Like Netanyahu wants those missiles flying across the border from Lebanon. They want to be under attack by Iran because then they're able to play the weak victim as opposed to the occupying far more powerful party, which is, when it's restricted to Palestinians, that's what they are. And so I think that they were definitely sensing the momentum towards an arms embargo and expanded the war accordingly. And when you look at what Harris has been able to do to Trump, I think she has done a really good job of naming his strategy. For instance, where she talks about, we had an immigration deal and they scuttled it. He instructed his people to scuttle it because he wanted to say we're under invasion. Now, I don't agree with her on immigration policy, but hats off that she's effectively described his strategy. Why can't she do this with Netanyahu? I mean, he's incredibly unpopular at home and abroad. Why doesn't she do it with Netanyahu? I mean, this is what.
Also, Netanyahu is as much a threat to her election chances as Donald Trump is in many ways, right? If Netanyahu wants her to lose.
That's his strategy too. She could name that strategy. Yeah.
So true. This is we talk about foreign interference in American elections. How about we talk about Israeli foreign interference? We have sitting ministers in the Israeli government saying they are waiting for Trump. They want Trump as a president. This is what the Israeli government coalition ministers are saying. And Netanyahu hasn't said it out loud, but we all know that's what he believes and that's what he wants. But she is busy pushing joy, Naomi, and I know you have some strong views on her pushing of joy.
I'm interested in branding. This is a sort of, in some ways, my first research.
Did you ever write anything on this subject?
When I wrote No Logo, it was not. Political parties were just starting to play with branding. It was not a thing that was talked about openly. But I wrote that book in the 90s. And Tony Blair had just rebranded the Labour Party, the New Labour, which was kind of like a Labour-scented party, if you recall. I think that was a line in No Logo. But we didn't yet have political parties using all of the most advanced tools of corporate branding. And that's what we have now. I mean, we have it with both parties. We have it with RNC. Each of them treat their conventions like multi-day advertisements. Then nothing is decided. In fact, if there's any dissent, it is promptly stomped out. I mean, it is a performance.
As we saw with the uncommitted movement.
Exactly. And so they have landed on this brand around joy, which frankly, I think it's a good brand in a moment where people feel absolutely dragged down by the sort of politics of rage. They're tired of feeling bad. And And so my discomfort with this and many people's is not the idea of advancing a politics of joy and giving people an opportunity to feel some joy. It's the gap between the brand and the product. And any good marketing consultant will tell you that you've got a problem if you have too big of a gap between your pitch and your product, because the whole thing can come crashing down. And I was watching it on television. You were in the room. Everybody who
it was very joyous.
But not everybody was feeling that joy. What did it feel like to you when
the uncommitted folks who couldn't get into the hall certainly weren't feeling the joy? I do think there's a cognitive dissonance here amongst grassroots Democrats. I met a lot of delegates, a lot of members of the party who said to me, they came up to me and said, keep fighting the good fight, keep speaking on Gaza. We're proud that you're speaking out. And those same people, I have no doubt in my mind, were also cheering to the rafters when Harris spoke, because I think there is a disconnect, right? They would love for the people of Gaza not to be killed, right? I don't think they're pro-genocide, the average Democrat delegate. But on the other hand, they're not willing to accept that their leadership are complicit in this genocide, right? They can't bring themselves. That would undermine their entire raison d'etre. Why are they Democrats? Why are they at this convention? Why are they cheering with signs? And I think that's a really difficult for a lot of people to comprehend. And so what do? They have to suppress it, right? They have to erase Palestinians from the stage. They have to erase the uncommitted people from the hall. They have to suggest nonsensical things like these people aren't Democrats, even though they're literally delegates who won 700,000 votes in the primaries and sent 30 uncommitted delegates to the convention. And they have to go back to what we started this segment with, they have to believe that their leaders are working for peace, right? That is what that line from Harris is all about. She's not Donald Trump. I just want to be clear. Donald Trump says, finish the job. Nikki Haley says, finish the job. Ron DeSantis says, they're all terrorists. Right. The Republican Party is fine to say, screw them, kill them, we hate them. The Democrats have to play this dance where we love you. We want your freedom. We want self-determination. We want a ceasefire. By the way, have some more bombs, no restrictions.
I mean, there's the hypocrisy of it, and then there's also whether or not this is sustainable as an electoral strategy, because the genocide is real, and it is ongoing. A truly apocalyptic situation that grows more apocalyptic by the day. Netanyahu does want Trump to be elected and is expanding into the West Bank, and we've seen some absolutely horrific video that has come out of just hand-to-hand home invasion, rape threats in the field. I mean, it's just, Zateo has put out that video, which, could be updated daily, the film of Israeli soldiers just proudly committing crimes, filming themselves. We've got some new lingerie videos. I mean, it's too big to be controlled by this party.
Could get bigger between now and November.
It is getting bigger already. And so, they're riding something very ephemeral, this sort of relief. Okay, Joe Biden's out of the way. Maybe we can defeat Trump. But the genocide is too big to be controlled by them. It is a reality overload. And a lot of what they're relying on is young people's enthusiasm and culture making and all of that. And that can turn on a dime. Young people are in this information soup. They're seeing the same imagery that we're talking about. And just as it became very cool to promote Kamala Harris as brat, it could become uncool overnight if this continues. I think they've got a lot of work to do.
One thing you said that jumped out to me, you said you wrote No Logo in the late 90s when Tony Blair was rebranding Labour. I think about Tony Blair rebranding New Labour, and when he did that, he stifled all dissent within the party, famously. Bill Clinton did the same to the Democrats in the 90s with the New Democrats, with the DLC. Bill Clinton, Tony Blair won their elections with ease. Tony Blair won a landslide. Kamala Harris is not on course for a landslide. She's neck and neck in polls with Trump. She is at risk of losing Michigan, maybe Georgia, where there are big Arab American, Muslim American populations. She doesn't have the comfort of Tony Blair's lead. And Bill Clinton, of course, was assisted by Ross Perot in 92. Harris has the reverse. She has Jill Stein eating into her young voters, left-wing voters. She has RFK, of course, now having not surprisingly endorsed Donald Trump last week. She doesn't have the ability to just say, well, you know what? Screw all of you. I'm going to do what I want. She has to reach out to everyone. I see Democrats online, Naomi, now saying, well, we don't need these people. Are you kidding me? Like, we're back to 2016 complacency? It's a super tight election. The idea that you would, ignore any potential gettable vote seems to me insane.
Well, exactly. And it isn't just about the votes that they think it's about, right? They're riding this wave of online virality. And this points to the difference between the 90s and now, right? Maybe they can impose discipline in an old media landscape where you can just put on a show for television and rely on TV ads and so on. But what they're enjoying is the kind of chaos of virality, right? They don't totally understand it though, because it's not in their hands, right? And so if the mood shifts, they've got a good mood now. If the mood shifts, it doesn't just affect those voters who they think they can win Michigan without. It affects a whole generation. I teach university students, Mehdi, classes start next week. And what happens on those campuses and what happens with student politics ricochets outward into the culture. And so they have a lot of work to do aligning their brand with reality on Palestine, not just on Palestine, also on healthcare, also on climate change. There's a lot of reality that people are dealing with. And that gap electorally has a lot to do, it maps a lot around university educated versus less educated. And in some ways, it maps who's closest to the pain, who can afford to sort of just feel the joy without real policies that are going to improve their lives.
It's funny you mentioned health and climate, both of which got not much of a look in at the DNC, certainly not in the presidential candidate's big speech compared to immigration or other such issues. And by the way, if you look on social media right now, already on US college campuses, it's already begun and police are already brutalizing protesters from what I'm seeing. Before we wrap up, one question to you, Naomi. You mentioned,
in Michigan, right? Yeah.
Yes, in Michigan of all places. You mentioned at the very start, the Harris line was, now is the time to get a hostage deal and a ceasefire deal done. And you and I both said, well, that was October. You also said, now is actually the time for accountability, right?
Now is the time,
What does that look like? Apart from war crimes trials, now is also the time to pressure. I mean, even if we got a ceasefire deal that was adequate to everyone tomorrow morning, which is very unlikely, what does that look like going beyond a ceasefire? What has to happen now to get justice, to get freedom, to get peace beyond a mere ceasefire?
Well, now is the time for pressure. Now is the time for pressure from below. And, there's a really powerful tactic that has been the tactic that Palestinian civil society have been calling for 2 decades now, a little bit more, and that is boycott, divestment, and sanctions, BDS, especially the S, because that incorporates weapons, an arms embargo. So that's how I think we align brand with reality.
Well, as we're wrapping up, you've just raised a huge issue, a very important issue close to my heart. I'm actually fascinated by the BDS issue because it's often misrepresented. It's demonized. A lot of people don't understand it, even not just on the pro-Israel side, but even on the pro-Palestinian side. I feel like there's a lot of confusion about what BDS is, what the goals are, how it works. I would love to do our next Unshocked, unshocking ourselves about BDS. What do you think?
Let's do it. See you then.
Okay, let's do it. Well, I will see you next month for that. That's all we have time for. I'm Mehdi Hasan.
And I'm Naomi Klein. And this
You're
has been
watching
Unshocked.